All right, analyzing research articles part 2, right? So in this case, what we're going to be talking about is the actual methodology, right? So this is where you can take a lot of exception. And once again, this is going to be a situation where what they did might have been pretty good, right? And arguably it probably was pretty good because it was published, but it could always have been better, right? Always. And, having published many articles myself, no research is perfect at all. There's always some flaw, some tweak, something that could have been done better. So I want you to go into this with that mindset of, okay, they might have done a good job, but how could it have been done better, right? This particular article I picked I picked it on purpose because it's terrible. It's very bad research. So it's real easy to find the flaws. So once again, if you want to pause it and read through some of these subsections before I go further, that's perfectly all right. But if you're reading it thinking, oh my gosh, this is terrible, yeah, it is. And that's why I picked this particular one because it demonstrates some of these flaws that should be fairly easy to find. What I would suggest going through this process is going kind of subsection by subsection. At this point, you probably know that most research articles are fairly formulaic in terms of how they're structured. So there's intro, lit review, methods, results, and conclusions, right? Basically, that's the five-stage flow that they tend to move through. Within each subsection, right? For example, like in the methodology has pretty formulaic subsections, things like participants, instrumentation, variables, conditions, whatever, right? So it's broken down like this. What I would recommend is going subsection by subsection and then kind of chewing through it, like each time you read through one. So we're going to start with the participants. And let me go ahead and say this. I believe I said this in a previous lecture, but there can always be more participants, right? So one of the flaws we tend to lean to is, oh, they didn't have enough participants. Well, that's like saying they didn't have enough money, right? If I was to say, how much money do you need? You might say, well, $1 million. No, 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 make it 10 million. How about a billion, right? How much money is enough money? There could always be more, right? So if you're saying, that was a flaw, they needed more participants, it's kind of a weak flaw. It's kind of an understood flaw, right? But in this case, they have 60 inner city youths, and that's going to be a flaw because if you think of the population, right, one of the big problems with urban or inner city schools is that they tend to be overcrowded, right? Too many students packed into too small of a school. So if you're thinking that's the kind of population you're dealing with, how are you only getting 60? Right? So yes, in this case, population, or rather, excuse me, sampling, the sample is too small, right? Because if you consider the massive size of the population, they only selected a very, very small sample, right? So, but kind of keep in mind, how does the population compare to the sample? If you were saying, I want to speak only to female veterans who are disabled and have PTSD, right? You're talking about a pretty precise population you're dealing with. So if you got a small sample, that's to be expected because you're dealing with such a precise and relatively small population, right? So kind of keep that in mind. Notice in this case too that they only used sampling from Newark, New Jersey, high schools from Newark, New Jersey. That's not going to be very representative, right? So when they're talking about urban or inner city youths, they can't make a generalization about that when they're only dealing with those from a single location. If you look at the demographic, I'll use my finger here, I'll use the cursor, there we go. If you look at the racial ethnic distribution of this sample, right, there was 48% African American, 32% Hispanic, Latinx, 10% Caucasian, and 10% other, right? One of the first places people go is like, ah ha ha, that's not representative. That's not a representative sample. Yes and no. That's a great place to start, right? So if you're thinking that already, representation, yes, think that in every study that you critique, and in real life too, because representation is massive, right? But in this case, we don't know that this is not representative. In the population they're examining, this might be a very representative sample, right? We don't know that though, and that's a flaw. The author needs to indicate if this is or is not a representative sample. If they say, these are the relative numbers of the population in general for this high school, okay, great. They have a representative sample. But they never confirm or deny this. And by the way, if they don't confirm it, it's probably because it's not true, right? So think of these articles almost like a dating profile, right? You only tell people what you want them to know. You don't tell them that, you steal office equipment or cheat on your taxes or whatever, right? You're not going to tell them the bad stuff. You just tell them the good things, right? So if there's something missing, assume something not stated, assume that it's missing, right? Um, and if we, move our way through this like this, it talks a bit more about the population or the sample that was used. If you notice, they talk about the different, I keep pointing, I should use my cursor here. They talk about why these students were selected. And if you look at the selection criterion, it varies from very minor, like truancy issues, right, or tardiness issues, to things like substantial antisocial behaviors, or substance dependency. Um, that's not very good, right? We don't want these people to be drawn in based on very wide, disparate sort of reasons. So already we see some flaws in this, some pretty substantial flaws. If we look at the counselors, keeping in mind in this particular study, there was counselors using either street talk or what they refer to in the study as standard English to see if they could establish a rapport and better disclosure that way, right? Um, sorry, my cat just jumped in my lap. In this case, they described the two counselors, right? Which is good. They had two. Fine. All right. But in this case, if you look at who they were, right? Counselor A was 42 years old and Caucasian. And then there's her criteria there, her CV, a short version of her CV, right? The second counselor, though, is 26 and Caucasian, right? To begin with, and you're probably already thinking this, that's a massive age disparity, right? Especially when we're talking about counselors, especially when we're talking about counselors potentially using street talk, right? So I'm 40, right? So almost as old as the first counselor, right? So 40, imagine me trying to use street talk to talk to young people, right? I mean, I don't even know what I would say. What's good, fam? Like, that's so lit. I don't even know. I don't even know what young people say. My kids aren't that old yet, so they don't really use slang. Um, so you see how if you think about this, especially if you think about it in the context of the actual study, that's really a very, very bad choice. A 26-year-old using street talk or slang, okay, sure, yeah, that's probably going to make more sense because they'll probably view her more as an older sister rather than a 42-year-old mother, right? One thing to point out, though, and you're probably already thinking this too, both counselors are Caucasian, which is not a bad thing necessarily, right? However, if only 10% of the sample we're dealing with is Caucasian, that's not a very good choice in counselors for this study. What would be a better choice would be a black counselor, or both counselors being black, or one black and one Hispanic Latinx, because then they would actually be more representative of the group that they're going to be speaking to. Right? So these are just things here. Is it bad that they used these two counselors that are both white and both from disparate ages? Not necessarily. It's not a deal breaker for the study. Could it have been done better? Absolutely. And that's what we're looking for, those kind of insights. The interviews themselves, I'm not going to go into that too much at all. I want to point out that there was only one interview with the participants, and they were 45 minutes long. Which, if I'm sure at this point you know quite a great deal about counseling and therapy, you're not going to establish a great rapport in the first meeting, right? Necessarily, and 45 minutes for that first meeting is not going to lead to a lot of self-disclosure in most cases, especially with 15 to 18-year-olds. If you've ever done any talking to people that are in this age demographic, no offense to any of them, it's like pulling teeth in the dark, man. I mean, like a lot of these teenagers do not want to speak to you, even if they like you. They might not want to speak to you. So I'm just saying, these counselors that they don't know, yeah. Anyway, here's the meat and potatoes, right? So if we look at the paragraph here, I keep pointing, there we go. This paragraph here, independent variable conditions, right? In this case, they outline what the street talk actually was constituted by, right? And if you'll notice, by the way, they're using Chisholm and Grady's standard for street talk from 1984. And I know slang kind of comes around cyclically, like certain words that were cool at one point might come back, right? But 1984, what were they using for slang in 1984? I have no idea because I was 2 years old, right? So to use 1984 street talk standards in a contemporary environment is going to be is ridiculous. Ridiculous. That's very poor design, right? Ideally, they would use a more contemporary form of street talk. And those of you who are more analytical in a lot of this, excuse me, might think, well, there's not just one version of street talk. How people speak in terms of slang has a lot to do with where they are located, the culture, ethnicity they come from, right? All sorts of factors, the school, their parents, the environment, everything, right? So, yeah. It's terrible. And if you get a chance, of course, you can pause the video and read about what they talk about that constitutes this ridiculous street talk, right? Vulgarisms and obscenities. I like the nonverbal gestures. So I've just got this vision of a 42-year-old counselor throwing gang signs or something like this. I don't know. I don't know. But if you go further down, when they talk about standard English, they never actually tell you what standard English is, right? Like, so am I using standard English right now to deliver this lecture? Is this standard English? I have no idea. And they don't articulate this. And as I said before, anything they don't talk about can be considered a flaw. You, as the reader, need to fully understand what they did based on what they tell you. And if you don't know, okay, if you're saying, well, what is standard English? I have no idea. That's a problem. That's a flaw already, right? So we want to make sure we kind of keep a running list of, okay, what did they do wrong? And more importantly, as I said earlier, how could it have been fixed, right? How could it be done better? What I would love to see as a thesis committee member, as a thesis chair, I would love to see that you point out what the research before you did badly and how your study improved upon it. I would just be so excited. I'm very geeky, you might have noticed, right? But that would make me so happy as a committee member to be able to say, you know what, yeah, they didn't do it as well as they could have, and then you did it better. Love it. So this last one here, and I apologize, we got kind of cut off here in the copy like this. Basically, they're talking about how they measure self-disclosure. Once again, they're using Hannigan's method from 1982, right? So it's 40 years old. Is that effective? It could probably be better. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with 40. I think, 40 is pretty good, right? But when it comes to research, there's got to be new methods, newer methods anyway, right? And they look at things like people sharing certain thoughts and everything like this, their wishes, their fears, very personal stuff, right? Which actually, I think this is one of the better aspects of the study. Ideally, it would be an updated version of self-disclosure measure, but this isn't terrible. This isn't terrible. So once again, when you're moving through this, don't think you're just looking for the things that are wrong with it. You could also say, well, you know what? That's actually pretty good. That's usable, right? Maybe it needs updating because it's 40 years old, but maybe there's not a newer version. Maybe everyone stopped after Hannigan in 1982 and said, that's a perfect one. We're going to leave it. Okay, fine. So, but the mindset, as you've probably seen now at the end of these two videos we've just gone through, is you want to have a very critical eye, not skeptical. Don't go as far as skeptical, but critical. And what it's going to allow you to do is it's going to allow you to pick out the things that you want to use to connect this study to other studies and ultimately build an excellent literature review that sets a great framework for your readers to better understand your thesis.